Was running it back the right move for the Phillies, or was it maybe the only move for the Phillies this offseason? Let's talk about it next, right here on the PHLY Phillies podcast. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the PHLY Phillies podcast. Tyler Zula here, and I know the Phillies are marred in a little bit of a slump right now. Struggled last night against the Giants. They've lost 2 consecutive series to the Braves and the Cardinals. Struggling with runners in scoring position. There's a lot of tangible things for people to think about as to why the Phillies have struggled over the last 7 games or so. But one thing I have seen on social media specifically a lot is the prevailing thought of, why would the Phillies run it back? Why would the Phillies come back with the same roster that faltered in the NLDS last year, that had, really significant, like, craterous valleys throughout the portions of the second half of the season last year? Why would the Phillies run it back? And the answer to this question is because they had to. There really was no other option. Now, we could talk about some specifics in just a second and how they could have not done that, but I think the overarching conversation really comes down to money, and money spent over the last few seasons. In 2021, the Phillies started to really kind of ascend into the monetary investment portion of baseball's offseason. They had a $190 million payroll, which was good for 5th across the league. Since then, they've increased it every single season from 244 to 245 to 246 to 279 this year. They have the 3rd highest payroll in all of baseball. They've been within the top 5 each of the last 5 seasons. So the fact is, this was always going to be a relatively quiet offseason for the Phillies, and I know that people don't want to hear that. And before I go any further, this is not me sitting here trying to justify losses or justify and make excuses for the shortcomings that this team has, because there are things that are real as to why they've struggled over the last week or so. And it's not me trying to hold water for the Phillies front office and Dave Dombrowski and the ownership group and things like that. They just weren't fiscally going to be like in play in major free agency this offseason unless the ownership group, unless John Middleton basically said bleep the luxury tax threshold and simply just not care about the amount of money that they were going to spend. So let's go back to the offseason for a second and talk about money as to why this was likeliest the scenario of all of the choices that the Phillies had, or of the few choices really that the Phillies had. This year's tax threshold was $241 million. That means right now the Phillies are about $38 million over that number with their $279 million payroll. They've also been over the luxury tax threshold for each of the last 3 seasons. So now they're paying a 50% rate on every dollar that they spend over that $240 million payroll. So that adds about another $19 million to their threshold. $40 million over the threshold, no matter how much you're spending, no matter what your percentages are, $40 million over that threshold, which would be $281 million, is where you started to lose your draft picks. Well, not lose your draft picks, but have your draft picks drop back 10 spots. I think that's something the Phillies likely didn't want to have happen. They already are going to be picking towards the back half of the first round because they were successful last year. I don't think they wanted to fall any further into the compensatory picks and into that range, into the 30s and the 40s, because of the fact that they might lose out on some talent in the latter portions of the first round. Some of the things that have happened over the last couple of years, monetarily speaking, have kind of gotten the Phillies to this point. Zack Wheeler's extension, which I think we can all agree has been a very well-deserved extension, kicked in this year. Last year, they extended Aaron Nola. You can argue amongst yourselves whether you would have given Aaron Nola that kind of money, that kind of extension, those kind of years, but monetarily, that is another portion of this conversation. They also traded for and extended JT Realmuto between the years of 2019 and 2022. And then, subsequently over the last couple of seasons in free agency have signed Trea Turner, Kyle Schwarber, Nick Castellanos, and the first one, of course, being Bryce Harper, to long-term deals in off seasons dating back to 2019. So what does that mean? Well, there really wasn't any tangible moves that the Phillies could have made from a money standpoint, from a free agent standpoint, in terms of like going on a spending spree. So unless you were able to find a trade partner who A, wanted a player on a long-term deal, B, had a player that you wanted to get back, and C, you had a player that team wanted to acquire and you wanted to give up, I think the the options were just limited for this team when it comes to the trade market conversation. So monetarily speaking, there really wasn't a lot of flexibility there. And I think in the trade market, there was a really small window of opportunity for the Phillies to make a trade that would bolster the major league roster. So to me, you're thinking about what are the players who had A, movable contracts, B, players that they were looking to give up or thinking about moving on from, and C, somebody that another team would want to get back. And then I guess D really is, would you get value back? They're not going to go look. They weren't going to go look for prospects in return. They weren't going to go look for guys that weren't major league ready because they did believe they were still in a win now mode. And I think they are still in a win now mode, even if the window has closed significantly over the last couple of years or so. So that really comes down to three guys, in my opinion, that the Phillies could have conceivably moved, and maybe a fourth if you add one veteran to the mix. So let's talk about that veteran first. It's Nick Castellanos, who has 2 years and $40 million left on his contract. Nick Castellanos has been a massive piece to your offense. I know the team is struggling with runners in scoring position, but he's been really successful this season. He's hitting .310. He's 11 RBI. He has 8 extra base hits. And if you take away that 5 strikeout night against the Braves a couple of days ago, and I know that that's not fair to do if I extrapolate one game from this situation, but let me do it for just a second. He's only struck out 6 times in 15 games. So I don't think the Phillies had any interest in moving Nick Castellanos. Oh, and by the way, he played all 162 games last year, and I would bet you he probably gets close to that again, assuming he stays healthy, in 2025. So I really think Nick Castellanos was out of the equation pretty much from the jump. So then it leaves you with 3 guys. And it's the 3 guys that have been lumped together since really they've all ascended or they were acquired because of the daycare moniker. It's Alec Bohm, it's Brandon Marsh, and it's Bryson Stott. So let's start with Alec Bohm, because Alec Bohm's name was in trade conversations all offseason. Would the Phillies move Alec Bohm? Would they go acquire a player like Nolan Arenado? Would they sign an Alex Bregman? Would they acquire another player that maybe we're not thinking about who could bolster the third base position for them? And nothing came to fruition. Now, whether that's because the Phillies didn't like what the return on investment was going to be, whether that's because the Phillies were asking for too much in return for Alec Bohm, who was coming off an all-star season, but also really struggled in the second half of the season and into the postseason. There was just a trade never materialized for itself. And I think that's because of a lot of different things. And so Bohm was the likeliest of the scenario to potentially get traded, and nothing materialized. So I really think it came down to nobody was willing to give up what the Phillies were looking for in exchange for Alec Bohm. There was conversations about the Mariners. I think that fell flat because the Phillies didn't want to take on the money of Luis Castillo's contract. And quite frankly, I'm not sure even if Luis Castillo was readily available and the Mariners were looking to move on from him. But regardless of what it was, the Phillies ended up keeping Alec Bohm, which felt like, from a money standpoint, was the right decision. Now, he's been really bad to start the year, and I'm not going to justify anything that he's done in hitting 150 and the double that he hit last night being just his second extra base hit of the first 16 games of the season. He's not been good offensively, but I think that there really wasn't a desire to move Bohm unless you were going to be able to replace him and get some pieces that will help this team in the immediate run. Whether that was make a trade and sign Bregman or make a trade for Arenado that included Bohm, whatever that case may be, my argument always was Bohm's coming off an all-star season and he's relatively cheap for his arbitration control. And I don't think the Phillies are looking to acquire Arenado's contract or spend big money on Bregman. And so Bohm seemed to make logical sense. Can't justify what he's done over the last couple of weeks, but at the time, it seemed to make sense. Then the next guy is Bryson Stott. And Bryson Stott, I think, is getting unfairly lumped into the conversations about Brandon Marsh and about Alec Bohm. I think Bryson Stott's been much better than what the majority of Phillies fans want to believe he's been in the first 3 weeks of the season. I'm not saying he's hitting .300, but I think his at-bats have been good. They've moved him up to the top of the lineup over the last couple of nights to see if he could provide a spark up there. He had a leadoff base hit against the Giants, which resulted in a run. He's seeing the most pitches per at-bat in Major League Baseball this year, just shy of 5 the last time I checked. So I think on top of the fact that he provides you stolen base threat, which he should probably do a little bit more of, quite frankly, and Gold Glove caliber defense at second base. I think Bryson Stott kind of sometimes gets unfairly lumped in with these two guys' struggles, the other two guys' struggles to begin the season. And I don't think the Phillies had much of an interest in moving Bryson Stott unless, again, they got an offer that really worked out for them. And then the final guy is Brandon Marsh. And quite frankly, I don't think anybody wants Brandon Marsh. I don't think anybody would like to acquire a player who has struggled the way that Brandon Marsh has struggled over the last 3 weeks of this season and the second half of last season, and really more so like the last 5 months of last season. And the book on Brandon Marsh has been out for a while, right? He can't hit left-handed pitching, but he struggled more and more and more as his Phillies tenure has unfolded against right-handed pitching. He can't catch up to high fastballs. His chase rates have gotten worse and worse, and his strikeout rates are way too high for a guy that you're entrusting with 400-plus at-bats. His defense is okay. He's a good defensive center fielder. I think he's a much better defensive left fielder, but I don't think there was a market at all for Brandon Marsh. And those are your three guys who I think theoretically you could have moved from the lineup to shake things up, if you will, to make a change within the lineup. And I don't think the Phillies had any interest in moving a couple of them. And there really wasn't any interest in receiving Brandon Marsh or, as it turned out, potentially Alec Boehm for what the Phillies were asking for. So the only other player's name that you could have conceivably thrown out there was Ranger Suarez. And when you acquired Jesus Luzardo, maybe that became a thought in your mind that the Phillies would move Ranger Suarez on the final year of his arbitration before he became an unrestricted free agent. But at the time, you were expecting Suarez to be your fourth or fifth starter. And unbeknownst to us, the back injury flares itself back up, and he hasn't pitched in the big leagues yet this year, and Taijuan Walker has had to fill in. That's really all that the Phillies could have done from a starting pitching standpoint and from a lineup standpoint to have materialized any type of trade, because, again, they were really monetarily hamstrung by the amount of contracts that they'd given out over the last couple of years. Now, I will say this, because I'm not trying to be all sunshine and rainbows and, or be like just depressing because of the facts of the matter. The one argument that I do think is fair is the lack of addressing the bullpen. The Phillies spent $12.5 million on Jordan Romano and Joe Ross this offseason. Now, I think the acquisition of Joe Ross was a fine one for $4 million. You've got yourself a swing guy. You've got yourself somebody who can throw multiple innings. Stuff's okay. Track record in Major League Baseball. But for $12.5 million, you got Jordan Romano and Joe Ross. Well, for $12 million or $12.5 million over the next 2 seasons and $33 million in total over 3 years, you could have brought Jeff Hoffman back. And the argument about Jeff Hoffman potentially wanting to go be a starter, I think, was overblown from the get-go. But for an average of $11 million per season, when you spent $12.5 on Romano and Ross, I think that's where your frustrations are totally valid. You could also say the same thing about Carlos Estevez. I know people were frustrated with Estevez, gives up the grand slam in the NLDS against the Mets, but he got $10 million a year for 2 years and then a club option in 2027 with the Royals. That's $10 million compared to the $12.5. I know you got 2 arms for basically the price of 1, but if those 2 arms don't add up to the 1, you've hurt your depth more than helped it by bringing in 2. It's a quantity over quality situation that the Phillies have found themselves early in the season. Romano has struggled. Ross is fine enough, but if you said to me I could have Romano and Ross or Jeff Hoffman, I would have brought Jeff Hoffman back. So all of this to say, I'm not saying that you don't have a right to complain if you feel like this team is struggling, because in some aspects the team is absolutely struggling. Runners in scoring position, scoring against starting pitching at times. Now, they did it a little bit last night, but then really slowed down. And then bullpen depth. And all those things are all very fair and all very questionable. But my question is, when you say, why would the Phillies run it back? I need tangible evidence. I need a tangible decision to be made as to what you would have done. Otherwise, you're just really pontificating. Because if you looked at the outfield market for free agency before the Phillies signed Max Kepler, other than Juan Soto, there was a couple of names that were high-end players that got big-time money. Teoscar Hernandez was one. He goes back to the Dodgers. Michael Conforto, who also signed with the Dodgers, those guys got big money. But outside of those guys, you were talking about players in center field, for example, like a Harrison Bader. I didn't have any interest in. Guys that were former major leaguers that ended up getting minor league deals, like a Michael A. Taylor type of player, a Dylan Carlson type player. Would you have brought Austin Hayes back? I think the answer unequivocally to that is no. So, like, I don't think there was a lot of options for this team in terms of financial investments in the free agent market for the players that they could have conceivably afforded, at the $10 million that they paid Kepler. And, making trades just didn't really feel like it was part of the equation unless you found somebody who blew you away for a trade for Bohm or found somebody who wanted to take Brandon Marsh. Now, one final time, I think your frustrations are valid for this team because they've been underwhelming the last week or so. And I do still believe that this is a good baseball team. It's a flawed baseball team, but I think it's still a good baseball team with a really, really good starting rotation that should help you keep afloat, assuming the offense can provide you more than what it's done with runners in scoring position early in games. And then over the last couple of nights against the Cardinals, specifically later in games, where like on Sunday, you saw them get retired 20 in a row to end the game. Those things need to be fixed. There's no question about it. But from a run it back standpoint, unless you have the ability to provide like tangible decision-making otherwise than what they've done, I think it's a flawed argument because they really didn't have a ton of other options heading into the 2025 season.